So hello everyone, thank you for joining today's session, Peer-to-Peer Connections with Rapido and ILLiad with Christopher Lee and Andrew Parker. In defining the purpose of today's session, we came up with the following. Libraries have developed connections with each other over the years of resource sharing and want to continue these relationships regardless of what resource sharing system they are using. One way to connect libraries using different resource sharing systems is via ISO peer-to-peer connections. This webinar will show the configuration for peer-to-peer connections between a library using Rapido and another library using ILLiad. Over this hour, we will show the configuration process in both systems to give a comprehensive look at how we can connect and discuss the advantages and disadvantages of this approach. The presenters are interested in establishing more connections with partners across the resource sharing ecosystem. I will add that the presenters are also exceptional community leaders, both in having worked in building knowledge and skills within the resource sharing community. And though the content will help their libraries build partnerships, it will also help the resource sharing network and community at large. We will spend some time today addressing questions at the end of the session and can follow up on any questions that aren't addressed today via email after today's session. Questions should be entered in the Q&A feature that you should be able to access. Okay, we can go to our next slide. So just for some context, today's webinar is intended to be an instructional session for libraries already using Rapido. So a warm welcome to other resource sharing community members. We're happy to have you here. However, with our intentions of this being a how-to session for the Rapido community of users, we are not doing an introduction to Rapido or a deep dive there, and our presenters are sharing information with the assumption of some familiarity to using and configuring Rapido. If you are here with a general interest in information about Rapido, please contact me and connect with me, and we can connect you with the right information and have further conversations after today's session. Additionally, today's information may not be as relevant or comprehensive if Rapido is not a resource sharing solution at your library, though you are welcome to be here. With that in mind, I'll give us a bit more information and introduction to today's content. So Rapido as a resource sharing solution is a part of the resource sharing ecosystem. As a library using Rapido, your library has the Rapid ILL pods for sharing book chapters and articles. There are the pods for physical resource sharing, and maybe you have them ordered in priority of use in geographical regional reference, such as this kind of visual shows here. Maybe you have your local consortia, then your state or other geographical area, then the nationwide pod, maybe that's the US pod, etc., and even the international sharing pod after that. Come January 2025, as a library using Rapido, you'll also have pods and functionality for ebook resource sharing too. As libraries using Rapido, you're familiar with the pod structure and ability to order pods based on priority of use for your partners. You'll also maybe be familiar with this visualization. Perhaps you've seen it in a past presentation. Beyond the pod rings in this visualization, we have additional partnerships in our resource sharing network. In addition to the pod network, as a library using Rapido, your network may include email partners, which include ALA partner types. These are partners that you've configured, and when you connect with them, you add them to a request if it isn't filled by your network. Once added to that request, they receive automatic emails from your requests, and you receive updates on the request from those partners via email. Other partners in this ecosystem that our community uses include the Reprints Desk and CCC Get It Now cloud apps via cloud app integrations, and they're accessed directly from the request. Or maybe you use a search in Real to Market action for another request to purchase pathway. Additionally, your library's network may include the additional option of integrations with additional brokers. This looks like your library using Reshare, ILLiad, or an additional broker running in tandem to Rapido. Often the broker is set up as a partner in your environment, meaning that if a request isn't filled by your network in Rapido, it moves to the other broker, and that broker is used for fulfillment via your networks in that solution. That may look like workflows being done in an additional broker when those requests move into that broker and they're not filled by your existing Rapido network. What we are speaking to today is an additional option beyond what has thus far been acknowledged. This is a network of peer-to-peer partnerships via ISO standards. Specifically, our presenters today are speaking on the how-tos and what-ofs of connecting peer-to-peer with partners who are using ILLiad, meaning one library is doing the configuration and workflow holistically in Rapido, while their partner is using ILLiad. These connections may be most relevant to libraries who aren't using additional brokers to connect with these partners alongside Rapido, or for libraries that are moving towards working with new partners or their existing partners in Rapido as opposed to in ways they're using their systems today. Or for libraries who want to use a locally managed pod made up of peer-to-peer partners, not as last resort, but somewhere else in their pod order. In our example today, both of our speakers are experts in using Rapido in their day-to-day. They're working to set up more peer-to-peer partnerships in their Rapido solutions with ILLiad partners. To support these additional partnerships, their presentation today will be for resource sharing partners and community in pursuing these connections. For clarity's sake, one of them is presenting the experience in being the library using ILLiad, and the other is working in that library using Rapido. For a little bit more clarification, the slides are a bit color-coded. So from the ILLiad perspective, will be in yellow slides, and from the Rapido perspective, will be in a bluish color slide. So moving to our next slide here. Now that you have context, thank you, Chris. Now that you have context for today's content, I welcome our presenters with gratitude and admiration for sharing their time and expertise in curating and deliver not only today's content, but also for their work within the resource sharing community. Reading left to right here, your content today is curated and delivered by colleague Drew Parker, the Systems Librarian at Brandeis University. Drew is the current ILLiad Rapido Working Group Chair. Joining Drew is Christopher Lee, the former ILLiad Rapido Working Group Chair and the Resource Sharing Manager at California State University System. And now I hand it over to Chris for the next slide here.
Thank you, Megan. Apparently I was muted. Sorry about that. So as a user of Rapido and other resource sharing platforms through my career, I think the future of resource sharing shouldn't be platform specific. At its bare essence, resource sharing is sending some kind of message to another library asking if you can borrow a book on behalf of your library patron. In many ways, it's like an email or a phone call, although we all know that's a bit more complicated. Would you want a phone service that only let you call people on their network? Some of the CSU libraries use Gmail and others use Outlook for our email platforms. Could you imagine if we couldn't send messages to each other inside our own consortium? We would never stand for that, and we shouldn't in resource sharing. Thankfully, many vendors agree and want to find ways to connect their networks. So, and there are ways to connect some platforms already. One of these happens to be the ISO standard messages, which lets us communicate between Rapido and, as we're going to show today, and ILLiad.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so ISO is our solution for trying to get an email-like solution that works across different platforms for resource sharing. Interestingly, ISO has two different resource sharing standards. There's the old one, 10161, and the new one, 18626. The new standard has a number of features to support newer functionality like controlled digital lending or whole ebook lending, but it also simplifies the standard some. And as I'll talk about a little bit, there are some quirks with the older standard that we're hoping more adoption of the newer standard will help to fix. I think systems can support one or the other or both. Alma Rapido supports both, but ILLiad currently only supports the older standard. However, I have heard in a webinar, which I will also be linking later in the presentation, that's fantastic, done by Atlas Systems, that 18626 is in the pipeline. So ILLiad will someday support, hopefully someday soon, support the newer standard. If you're curious what ISO stands for, it's the International Organization for Standardization. And if you're curious why that doesn't spell in the order of ISO, but that'd be more like iOS, right? It was the idea behind this, of the people that founded this international organization, that the acronym not actually work in any particular language, because of course they represent many different languages as a part of this organization. I admit I find that explanation a little bit funny. I don't know if, I guess my preference would be that it works in one language. But I guess if you want it to be the International Standards Organization, even though officially it's not, that can be like your headcanon, I guess, if you would like it to be. It is for me. Just continuing off the email model from Chris's slide, there is, as you might not be surprised, an ISO standard for email as well. So that ISO standards very much contribute to interoperability between systems and things that we use every day. And taking advantage of that in the resource sharing space has a lot of potential for sure. Okay, so moving to the next slide here, what are the advantages, disadvantages of ISO? Just speaking to our experience at Brandeis, we found that it works reasonably well for physical borrowing and lending. There can certainly be quirks in terms of messages like shipped and received being transmitted, and it seems to be a little finicky there, but we've never really experienced quirks with the requests themselves once we've gotten the connection successfully established, like not showing up at all or something like that. Doesn't work as well for articles in our experience, and we have much less need for it for articles, of course, because with Rapido, we have Rapid ILL. At Brandeis in particular, we don't have ILLiad, we don't have Odyssey, so we don't have any way of receiving the files. And fundamentally, ISO is just a way of sending and receiving messages between one peer and another peer. So there's no Odyssey-like mechanism built into it or anything like that. And for the limited ISO article resource sharing that we have done, we've kind of done it through workarounds like an ISO message that includes a link to article exchange or something like that. I would also say as a disadvantage that it's not ideally integrated into borrowing workflows on the ILLiad side of things. So it's not like that one-stop shop that you can get from Wiltshire ILL. If you want to be able to quickly search your ISO holdings of partners that you have, you could use something like Z3950, or it would be possible to use the decision support pipeline along those lines as well. Z3950 functionality does work fairly well from how I've seen it demoed, and again, we'll be linking to an ILLiad video that shows that. I think it's really helpful, interesting detail. But we haven't worked with a partner that's used it a lot, and Z3950 is not a perfect solution. It's certainly not going to be quite as easy as using Wiltshire ILL for that purpose. I would say it's a lot of connections to manage as well, but we haven't had that much trouble once we've set up an ISO connection with an ILLiad institution in like needing to make changes to it subsequent to that. We've had, with other ISO partners, we've had some need to do that because we have a lot of them, and it's with a public library system that we've set up that ISO partnership through AutoGraphics. But for the purpose of this presentation, it does take some time to set them up sometimes if things don't go totally smoothly. Sometimes things do go totally smoothly and it's very painless. And we haven't had to, change those connections much once they're set up. So segue into difficulty of setup in ILLiad here.
Chris, we aren't hearing you here.
Apparently I got muted again, sorry. So thank you, Drew. It's for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to take on the role of a library using ILLiad for resource sharing. Now, we tested the ISO connection setup in the CSU libraries where we could see both sides of the setup. So we would have one CSU library acting as the Rapido library and one as the ILLiad library for our testing. Overall, the configuration for ILLiad is not difficult. The only tricky part is configuring the ILLiad server to allow Ex Libris IP addresses to communicate with ILLiad. Now, this is tricky for me personally and many people in the resource sharing community, not because it's hard, but because we often don't have access to the server, or I personally don't know much about servers. But thankfully, the Boston Library Consortium and Brandeis University maintain some documentation on the steps to set up that access. And we have the link in the slides, but we'll also link it out to you in the chat as well. Now, if you're hosted by Atlas or OCLC, you can ask them to make the changes to the server since they maintain the servers, and just give them the directions and usually wait a couple days and they'll do that for you, at least in our experience. Now, if you're self-hosted, you can talk to your library IT person or people, and they should understand what to do because they know a lot more about this stuff than I do.
Now I'm unmuted. Okay, and now as to difficulty of setup in Rapido, it really isn't difficult at all. Most of the complication is definitely on the ILLiad side. And there's a recent feature we've linked to there in the slides, automatic partner creation, that can potentially make things even easier. So if an ILLiad request comes in, a partner, and you don't have a partner record for that associated ISO request, a partner record gets created. And I'll show an example of that here in just a bit. And both for Chris and on my end of things, we found that that can actually solve problems that you might have sending the requests back and forth. So you might not want automatic partner creation on all the time, but I think if you're trying to set up a connection, it can be a good idea if you're not sure what's wrong, or like you created the partner record manually and it's still not working for whatever reason. You will want to configure the partner, as we'll show a bit more, and then also optionally add a locate profile, which we'll discuss a bit as well. One important thing to note, which Chris will also be showing, is Alma Rapido uses 9001, the port 9001 for ISO. That is important. So it's a different port number for ILLiad, and for Rapido, it's don't worry about that too much. It's just there's one place where you have to enter that in both systems that will show.
Thank you, Drew. All right, so let's get into the actual configuration of ILLiad. We're going to go step by step through both sides of the configuration so you can see the process from end to end in both ILLiad and Rapido. Now, as I said before, the first step in ILLiad is to contact the person, people, or organization that hosts and maintains your ILLiad server. If you're self-hosted, this is probably IT. If you're hosted by OCLC, contact OCLC support. If you're hosted by Atlas, contact Atlas support. Regardless of who you contact, give them the same instructions to open specific IP addresses and ports used by Ex Libris Clarivate. Now, if they have any special instructions for address changes, you can configure that to match an ILLiad using these instructions as well. For example, in one instance, an Atlas hosted library that we talked to used different addresses in a different format than was typical, but we were able to just put in those addresses and it worked fine. All right, with the server side done, you can move on to the rest of the configuration. You will need to go to ILLiad Customization Manager, shown here, and go to System, highlighted in red, and make the following changes. Then you go to the ISO ILL defaults and set ISO enabled, ISO IFM borrowing, and ISO IFM lending to yes. Set those all up, and you're halfway there. Input your ISO return IP address and add the port 1611. That's the ILLiad port. And then set an ISO system ID, probably your existing OCLC symbol. And lastly, set your system ID ISO symbol to the same ID that you set the ISO system ID. So again, probably going to be your OCLC symbol. And that is it for Customization Manager. You really just have to check a few boxes and put in an IP address and you're good to go. You can now add Rapido or Alma peer-to-peer partners in ILLiad itself to start sharing. And these steps here, you only need to do once. You do this to make it so you can do ISO partnerships, and then you add the ISO partners in ILLiad, and you can add as many ISO partners as you want. So if you were going to partner with the CSU, you would add all 23 of our libraries. Now, in ILLiad, to add the partners, you go to Lending and Addresses to start making them. You'll need to do this with every ISO partner you want to add. So again, if you want to partner with us, you would add a whole bunch of libraries. Thankfully, the process is very fast and easy as long as your partners share the relevant information from you, for you. This is what the full screen of ILLiad looks like, but that's really small. So let's do a little close-up. Sorry for the blurriness. You go to Lending and Addresses, and then a pop-up will appear after clicking the addresses. And this is where you can actually make the partner. To successfully connect, you must add a unique symbol from the Rapido library's Alma instance and their ISO information. I also suggest adding their shipping and billing addresses so you can print shipping labels and send invoices to them in the unfortunate event that a book goes missing. As we all know, that does unfortunately happen from time to time. And here are what the required field look like when they're all filled in. And it's very small in this slide, so let's take some close-ups of those sections so we can look at them more closely. Now, first is the symbol. This symbol must match the symbol configured in the Alma or Rapido library's resource sharing settings. When we tested this configuration, we had a difficult time figuring out where this symbol lived and assumed it was the institution code that used in Rapido located at the beginning of a library's external ID numbers. But we learned it's a very different symbol when we kept trying to place requests and they kept going off into the ether. Now, if you are the ILLiad library, you just need to ask the Alma library to provide this number. If you are the Alma library, go to Alma configuration, switch the configuration to the library set as your resource sharing library. Go to fulfillment, library management, then library details, and then scroll down to resource sharing information, and you will find the symbol. It is essential that it is essential the ILLiad library is provided with the correct symbol. Otherwise, the request will not go through. It'll disappear. At least I hope it disappears. And otherwise, we sent some weird tests to some random people. I apologize if that's the case. All right. Next, we need to enable ISO and add the Ex Libris IP addresses and port number. The ISO type is TCP/IP, and the IP address will be one of a handful supplied by Ex Libris to the Rapido library. So just ask the Rapido library to get that IP address for you. After the IP address, add a colon and the port number without any spaces, and the port number is always 9001. And so this number is really easy to find. You don't have to ask anyone for it. It's right there. It's always the same. Then add their department email, and you're all set to request materials from this partner. It's actually a good idea to send a request at this point to the borrowing partner, because if they have set up automatic partner creation and have that enabled, the request will automatically bring in most of your settings and make most of the partner in the Rapido library that you can connect to. And in my experience, a partner created through automatic partner creation always worked for us. We didn't really have any human errors of forgetting to add a piece of information or adding the wrong piece of information when that was enabled. So I highly recommend sending a request at this point and having it make the partner in Rapido. And now over to Drew to show what happens in Rapido.
Thanks, Chris. We're looking at Rapido here, and this is an example of a record that was created via that automatic record creation. So one quirk that you would see, and it's somewhat small text, I admit, in the top right, is that the name appears as CNO, and you would probably want to make that a more human readable name in this case. You can see that the profile type defaults to ISO, which is good. In this case, the system type defaulted to other. It looked like that worked fine, but I would probably change that to ILLiad for a connection we were using in production. And then you can see that a workflow profile was set based on, like the default profile was set for both borrowing and lending. And we'll talk a little bit more in a subsequent slide about those workflow profiles. Moving to the next slide here.
Skipped one, sorry.
Oh, sorry, no problem. So you can see the address automatically filled in there. I did notice that for this automatically created partner, again, the email addresses were a bit incorrect. So again, as is the case with the ILLiad address record, I would review that information, make sure you have all the addresses you want in the record. Then that third tab we're going to look at is the parameters tab. Again, automatically created here from the ILLiad request that came in. You see the server. If you were manually creating the record, make sure not to include HTTP or HTTPS in that server address, because at least last time that I did it, I was getting errors for that reason and didn't realize that was the cause. You can see the port number 1611 is what ILLiad uses, so that's what you are always going to want to put in the Alma Rapido records when you're connecting to ILLiad institutions. The symbol automatically appears there, and then you can set the expiry time to be whatever you want. It's really very straightforward. One thing I did have in the slides previously that I forgot to mention, but that I will make explicit here, is that you can add a record from the resource sharing directory as well. You don't have to rely on automatic partner creation or manually creating the record. Workflow profiles here on the next slide. So you may not have worked with these, I'm not, depending on your level of experience, but they determine what steps can and can't be taken by the borrower and lender. For instance, like, is something renewable? Should the option to make a renew request appear, or the option to recall something appear? One mistake we did make is we had lender check-in checked in the wrong place in our workflow profiles. And so when the borrower returned the item, the request was closing before the lender had checked it in. And in my opinion, the place in the workflow profiles that you're supposed to configure that, because there's actually that option on both the borrowing and lending side, wasn't totally clear. So I feel like the workflow profiles are a little counterintuitive. I did link the documentation there. If you have questions about that, I would reach out to support, or of course the listserv, and hopefully you can get clarification. But I feel like it's just something that could be improved a little bit, because I find it hard to follow reading the documentation. Great, so I just included an example of a borrowing workflow in terms of what was and wasn't checked on the Brandeis side of things. Next slide is the Z3950. So Z3950 is a way, again, it's an ISO-like standard. It's not actually an ISO standard, I don't think, but it's a standard for searching in other libraries' holdings. I think ideally, for sure, you would want to use an Alma locate profile if you can. Alma locate profiles are going to give you more accurate results, but say they're not an Alma institution, you're a Rapido institution, you want to connect to them and be able to search their holdings automatically, you may have Z3950 as an option. One common thing to kind of look out for as to whether you would be able to use Z3950 is whether that institution you want to be able to search the holdings of actually allows traffic from outside their network to use Z3950, because in a few different examples, we haven't been able to use Z3950 because of that kind of security restriction. And it's just kind of up to the institution as to whether they want to do that. It's not, best practices aren't like totally set in stone there. It's kind of just at the discretion of that institution. But if you can use Z3950 because it's open to more than just that institution's network, the steps are a little bit different than you would follow for a normal Alma locate profile, which is not something we detail here. But you would actually submit a ticket to ILLiad to have an institution added to a dropdown, and then you can select them as we did in this example with Wellesley College. So we had to put in the ticket, the host for the Z3950 server, the ports, the database. Wellesley gave us all this information. And in this case, a username and password wasn't required. Sometimes it is required. And if it is required, it's required in that username/password format, which wasn't documented at the time that I was doing it. So I just thought I would note it there. ILLiad will, last time we submitted one of these, it was turned around very quickly in terms of us then being able to select it as a resource to search. You can see an option there in addition to having chosen Wellesley, enrich with holdings, and you may be able to improve your results that way. We don't actually have that much experience using, we tried to use it in one particular case and then ran into problems unrelated to that functionality. So you may want to try enrich with holdings to get even more accurate Z3950 results. Oh, yes, and we had alluded to this training video. Atlas has a really great ISO training video that also includes information on how to search multiple Z3950 partners at once. I had no idea this was even possible until the video came out, and the video came out like just earlier this year, I think. So couldn't recommend it enough. I think Stephanie Spires at Atlas did a great job of going over some of the setup stuff too in ILLiad in good detail. So just a lot of fantastic information in that presentation. She talks about creating custom searches for ISO requests if you want to do that. If you're interested in this, it's just a 30-minute video too. So really, really excellent resource.
All right, thank you, Drew. So now it's time to request items from your new partners in ILLiad. Again, I do also highly recommend that other training video to look at the workflows in ILLiad. I am not an expert in the workflows in this. We've done testing on it, so it might be a good tool to use to get ready for the testing if you are the ILLiad library. Because in ILLiad, it's slightly different than a normal request, and it can be done several different ways depending on if you have Z39 set up. If you have Z39 set up, you can search the ISO, ALMA, or Rapido partner using Z39, the Z39 tab in the ILLiad request itself. That tab is right here. If you do have it set up, if you do not have it set up, you can still search that library's catalog and know, okay, this is a request that they can potentially fill. You can do that manually, or you can also blindly request the item. Just request it to your list of ISO partners. But this may result in an auto reject if none of those partners have the item. But if they have the item, they'll get the request and can fill it. So that does work as a easy workaround of just, oh, you've exhausted your partners, local partners in ILLiad, and you want to go to your local partners that are you have through ISO. You can just try them all and see if any of them work. Now here's a closer look of the one part that you have to look out for. To send a request through ISO, you need the lending string to match the partner code and the system ID to be set to ISO. So this here needs to be set to ISO, and the lending string and add the ISO partners. And as said before, you can check Z3950 to choose which partners to use when making that string, or you can go straight to requesting and just add all your ISO partners and possibly get canceled at libraries who don't actually own the item. And then click send, and you will have made your borrowing request. Everything else in borrowing after that point works exactly as it does normally. So you just really need to make sure to switch to ISO and add your lending string of interested partners. And now, once you place a borrowing request in ILLiad, that request will go to Rapido on the lending workflow, which Drew can talk about.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, Rapido lending workflow, it couldn't really be any easier. You can just follow the steps that you would for a normal lending request, unless you somehow had changed the workflow profile for ISO in some specific way or something like that. So you're not even looking at a different queue like you have for awaiting ISO request processing in ILLiad. It's really very easy to process on the lending side. On the borrowing side, you have a few different options. You can, of course, add an ISO partner directly to a request as you would any other type of partner. You could also add them to a locally managed Rapido pod, which we've shown a little bit of here in the next slide. This is something that we don't actually do at Brandeis and would like to, but you can set up a locally managed Rapido pod, set your loan period and delivery time, and then order that pod accordingly. Like in our particular case, we have a lot of ISO partners that are actually geographically very close to us. And so it would make sense to use that locally managed Rapido pod functionality to order the partners close to us above some of our other Rapido pods, as you can see in this next slide. So yeah, you don't need to, we were describing the locate profiles before, those aren't required. You can just, if you don't have a locate profile, you can add partners directly. You could add partners to an ALMA rota, you can add them to a locally managed Rapido pod as well, and kind of benefit from the full functionality that Rapido provides with ISO partners that are using a different system.
Thank you, Drew. I have tested out using it as the as a locally managed pod, and it works perfectly. The request goes to the ISO partner, and if it's rejected, it goes on back into Rapido to the next pod in the list. exactly as we would want it to. So works great. Now, for lending in ILLiad, so you place the request in Rapido, borrowing, and then it goes to ILLiad, lending. The request will go to a new queue, which will automatically appear in ILLiad. You don't have to set it up. It just happens automatically, called the Awaiting ISO ILL Request Processing Queue. Now, other than the new queue, the requests are processed exactly as they normally are for lending. You don't have to do any change of workflow here. The requests will have the system ID automatically set to ISO because they came from ISO. So while it's a good idea to, glance at it and make sure that, yeah, it's set to ISO, it should be fine. It'll be that way automatically. You then either ship or reject the book using your normal workflows, and you're done. Now, in our testing, we noticed updates and statuses are often communicated between the systems using the ISO standard messaging. So you can mostly treat them as you would any other request. It'll say, it got to the Rapido library just fine, and oh, it's being shipped back. All that seemed to work fine. All right. And then Drew has a bit more experience with the troubleshooting side of the ILLiad than I do. So I'll leave this one to Drew, even though it's a yellow slide.
Yeah, so in terms of troubleshooting, I just thought I would provide or list a few of the most common issues. Sometimes it goes totally smoothly, as I said in a previous slide, and sometimes you'll run into some small unexpected issue. I would say the most common issue is symbol mismatch, and that's the problem that automatic partner creation takes care of. Because if you're creating the partner record based on what's sent in ILLiad, you're going to have their correct symbol in there. If you are creating the records manually, and we have run into weird issues with trailing spaces and ISO symbols that you can't actually see until like you copy paste it and you see that there's a space at the end. So that's a possible problem to look out for. I would be aware that there can be a delay of a minute or two for requests to appear. I believe the way it works in ILLiad, based on that excellent webinar that we linked to previously, it'll check like every minute for, ILLiad will check every minute for new requests or new ISO operations to perform. And so if you don't see your request get updated or sent or received on the other side immediately, it doesn't mean that it didn't work. I would give it a minute or two in most circumstances, but it can be faster than that too. We did run into an issue where we had enabled ISO, but a particular person had customized their ILLiad client layout, and they actually had to reset it to see the ISO options. So that's another problem to be aware of. Shared server implementations do require some additional steps. That's pretty well detailed on the ILLiad side of things in that ILLiad webinar, but definitely be aware of that. And some of the more complicated implementations that we've done, we were able to always figure it out, but it was because it was a shared server implementation and there's a little more to be done there. I think the your log in ILLiad can be really useful. It can also be kind of overwhelming. Logging does need to be enabled in the first place. You want to make sure that's enabled. And then once you're looking at that ISO log, you can maybe search for error, because otherwise you'll see a bunch of other log information that may or may not be relevant. And typically, if I'm trying to look through that log, it can be kind of daunting. But going to the trying to know, okay, well, when exactly did I make the request, and then going to that exact point in the log. And if you're not seeing anything in that case, like it could speak to another issue entirely. Like if you were expecting to receive a request and there's absolutely nothing in the ISO log, say you're like a self-hosted institution, that there's a good chance that would be a firewall issue or something like that. But the log can definitely be helpful, but can also be a little overwhelming. And support Atlas OCLC can assist with that as well, making sense of that log. Great. We did want to have a little action slide here at the end. We highly recommend that institutions add themselves to the directory. I didn't actually realize until we were planning this presentation that ILLiad institutions can do that. So if you're an ILLiad institution and you wanted to share your resource sharing information with the community, that's very possible to do. You don't have to be using all resource sharing or Rapido. Keep in mind that unless you have automatic partner creation on, a partner record has to exist on both sides for the request to actually requesting to actually work. So if you were worried about getting random requests, that shouldn't happen unless there's a partner record on both sides. And we recommend enabling data sharing as well. So if you have data sharing on, that Find Partners functionality in Alma Rapido can be used to let a library know that your library is a partner that could potentially provide this and can lead to potentially fruitful resource sharing partnerships. So I know that there's other things to consider with the data sharing. I linked to the FAQ there, but it is a really neat feature that we would love to make more use of in terms of finding partners that way. Yeah, this is a little bit of a throwaway slide here at the end, but there are a lot of different new resource sharing systems on the horizon, and so including Rapido, of course, which is relatively new, at least relative to ILLiad. So I think keeping in mind that with an increasing number of options in the resource sharing ecosystem, either being available now or about to be available, it's really a great time to be thinking about how we can interoperate between our different systems with ISO.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Partnerships are very important in resource sharing, as I'm sure you all know. And both the CSU and Brandeis would like more interested ISO partners to share with in resource sharing. If you are an ILLiad library and you want to connect, please contact Drew for Brandeis or me at California State University to connect with us. We're both always looking for more friends, robot or otherwise. And lastly, now we have a few minutes for questions. And I will stop sharing my screen. And if you have any questions, let's go over them.
Thank you. So I'm checking in the Q&A and the chat for questions. So if you've got questions at this time, please put them into preferably the Q&A area, and I can pass them to our speakers here today to address your questions. If it's a little bit more nuanced, it may require us to do some follow-up as opposed to being able to get to it today. The only question I'm seeing at this time is kind of suits that case, so I can follow up with that question later on, but at this time, waiting for your questions to share with our speakers. So we'll hang tight while you might be typing away. And then I think one of these many questions that we get is, will the session be recorded? It will be recorded, and we're going to embed it within the documentation. Additionally, our presenters have curated links, and I believe they're also willing to make the slides available so that we can share those with the community as well. Okay, and I'm seeing the link to the slides already in the chat, so you should be able to access that. Okay, I see one question related to, I'm not fully understanding your question, so we'll ask it to the best that I can understand it and answer it to the best that we can understand it. The person asks, as newbies to Rapido, is it better for us to bring up Rapido with pods and then explore these options? From what I'm understanding there is I recommend to do both, and I anticipate that would be the recommendation of our speakers here. Joining the various pods that you're eligible for and that you want to participate in, as well as building these ILLiad partnerships. If the nuance more to the ordering of things, I think Chris and Drew both spoke to that and could speak to that more, but it might just depend on who your preference is for using partners. Do either of you have anything to add as far as kind of that train of thought as pods versus ILLiad partners?
Sorry, no, oh, Drew, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think absolutely making it the nail on the head. Rapido pods are so easy to join that, like, if you can make your partnerships that way, like definitely do that. And then you can pursue some of these other options as well and pursue an order that makes sense to you as far as where you want to have the Rapido pods listed.
All right, I'm not seeing additional questions at this time. And so thank you all for being here today. And thank you so much to Chris and Drew for their time in presenting and curating content for this session today. The recording will be available. And please follow up with us if you have additional questions, and our links have been made available for the resources that were curated and provided today. Thank you, everyone.